Okay, the committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement for 5 minutes, probably shorter. So a few weeks ago at our hearing on pathways to service, there was some interesting discussion around the concept of small wins. There's a natural tendency in Congress to focus on hitting legislative home runs, but small wins can provide a sense of great accomplishment, and over time they can accumulate into big wins. Let me give an example. In the 116th Congress, this committee recognized the need for a specialized group of technologists, designers, and others to support the House's internal and public-facing operations. And we recommended establishing a Congressional Digital Services Task Force. Passing the recommendation was a small win. The next step was demonstrating its worth. So leading by example and practicing what we preach is a big part of this committee's ethos. There's real value in showing that it's possible to actually do the things that we're recommending. And this is why the committee decided to pilot the first ever Congressional Digital Service Program. In the spring of 2020, the committee brought on board 4 digital service fellows and deployed them to various House offices to help with existing efforts to modernize Congress. The fellows successfully contributed to a number of modernization projects, including digital signatures, the e-hopper, and various constituent management systems. These small wins resulted in the creation of an official House digital service earlier this year. I'd certainly classify this first of its kind effort in Congress as a big win. There are a couple reasons for sharing this story. The first is that it's a great example of how it's entirely possible to accomplish big things by taking a small wins approach. That's especially important when it comes to IT modernization. Incremental improvements made consistently over time can lead to transformational change. The second is that it demonstrates Congress's desire and willingness to address its own institutional shortcomings. We know that Congress has a lot of catching up to do when it comes to technological innovation. These issues are complicated and require the kind of expertise that Congress has traditionally lacked. The House Digital Service will help identify pain points and develop solutions so that members and staff can better serve the American people. This is an especially important point to keep in mind as we discuss various IT challenges today. There's a tendency to view Congress's technological shortcomings as insurmountable, but they're not. And the third is that it proves what's possible when outreach and listening are built into the process. The committee didn't develop the idea of a House Digital Service out of thin air. We spent a lot of time listening to members and staff talk about their IT challenges and a lot of time listening to institutional and technology experts talk about solutions. Setting that kind of example matters, and I'm thrilled that the CAO's office has built outreach into its process for standing up the House Digital Service. They're meeting with digital directors to better understand what the technology trends, challenges, and needs are across the House, and they're doing listening sessions with member offices to learn more about common IT obstacles. I'm looking forward to hearing what recommendations the experts joining us today have for ensuring that Congress is equipped to take full advantage of the latest technological innovations. And given the process I just described, I'm also really interested in hearing your thoughts on strategies for getting Congress focused on tech modernization. So with that, let me welcome if Vice Chair Timmons has an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been doing this 3.5 years, and I cannot believe you didn't use your line that Congress is an 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. This might be the only hearing he didn't use that in the opening, so I think it's a very appropriate hearing to mention that. I've been here 3.5 years. One of the first hearings we had on the Modernization Committee, I brought my pager. Literally, they gave me a pager when I got sworn in. I still have it in my office. Apparently, we have to pay for it, and I guess I've been paying for it for 3.5 years, but we got to look into that. I'm not sure if I actually have to pay for that, but if I do, we might have to give it back. I don't think anybody uses the pagers these days. Mr. Dwyer, your apps you've created are incredible. Dome Watch is awesome. Dome Directory is fantastic. Before we started the hearing, I was mentioning to him that I literally was working with an app development company to try to create Dome Directory, and then I happened upon it, I guess, shortly after it came out, and I was like, that's a great idea. I had it first, but couldn't actually implement it. So I can't wait to hear other things you're working on and other things that you think we can do to make this place more efficient. I spend a lot of time thinking about the calendar and the schedule and overlapping obligations while we're here, and I do think that creating a committee calendar that deconflicts, or at least just shows committee chairman and chairwoman what the conflicts are to create at least an option that would have the least conflicts possible, maybe including some kind of block scheduling to allow different committees to deconflict. That involves us being here more. We can't be here 65 days in a year and be able to get all of our work done. It inherently overlaps, and then we only spend 5 minutes in committees reading things that have been prepared for us, as opposed to learning from one another's ideas and collaborating and legislating. So I do want you all to touch on time and things that you think we can use technology to become more efficient. I think the Dumb Directory app facilitates relationship building, and I just want to point that out. Generally speaking, it's really hard to know your colleagues, and when you have 435 of them, it is just challenging to know who everybody is, know what committees they serve on, and it's been very helpful. I use Congress in Your Pocket, which is $500 out of your MRA, and your entire team gets to use it, and I've found that that's been very helpful in understanding who serves on what committees, what their position is on the dais, and just it makes you more competent as a legislator because you know your colleagues and you can easily assess where they're from and what they're working on. So technology has the ability to make us better at our job, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on things that we can recommend to make this place work better. And thank you for being here. With that, I yield back.
I know I missed some of the formal technical stuff I was supposed to read. So with that, the committee will use its rules that allow for a more flexible hearing format that encourages discussion and the civil exchange of ideas and opinion. In accordance with Clause 2J of House Rule 11, we will allow up to 30 minutes of extended questioning per witness, and without objection, time will not be strictly segregated between the witnesses, which will allow for extended back and forth exchanges between members and the witnesses. Vice Chair Timmons and I will manage the time to ensure that every member has equal opportunity to participate. Additionally, members who wish to claim their individual 5 minutes to question each witness pursuant to Clause 2J2 of Rule 11 will be permitted to do so following the period of extended questioning. Okay, so with that, I'd like to welcome our 3 witnesses who are here to share with us their expertise on technology in Congress. Witnesses are reminded your written statements will be made part of the record. Our first witness is Stephen Dwyer. Mr. Dwyer serves as Senior Advisor to House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, where he focuses on technology policy and digital strategy. He's the chief architect and manager of Dome Watch and Dome Directory, the popular apps used to closely follow the House floor and identify members of Congress. Mr. Dwyer, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Kilmer and Vice Chair Timmons, for the opportunity to testify today. I have had the honor of working for Majority Leader Steny Hoyer for nearly 20 years. I've always focused on technology, tech policy, digital comms, and most uniquely working on civic technology. Leader Hoyer, through his leadership budgets and staff, has always prioritized digital tools that benefit members, staff, and the institution of Congress. This often has had the added benefit of making Congress more open and transparent. I have been fortunate to have had Leader Hoyer's trust in leading many of these efforts. Our biggest success is the Dome Watch app, which has been installed on over 100,000 devices over 7 years. It is heavily used by members, staff, and others who closely follow the House. We have another app called Dome Directory. We also run a private intranet for Democratic staff called DemCom that has been in heavy use for 14 years. It does many things that we saw lacking in Congress, like a resume bank, a staff directory, and a database for internal documents. We've built other custom systems, including ones for whipping votes and measuring members' reach on social media. We have co-hosted, along with Republican leaders Cantor and McCarthy, 4 official congressional hackathons over the past 10 years. These events have helped foster a community of people on and off the Hill who are interested in the digital infrastructure of Congress. My top recommendation is simply that Congress should better prioritize digital technologies across the board. I commend the Modernization Committee for doing exactly that over the past few years, and the institutional offices that have accelerated progress of late. Like we did with C-SPAN in the 80s, websites in the 90s, social media in the early 21st century, we need to adopt modern digital tools to improve the functions of Congress. This is happening everywhere. Stores and restaurants all have online ordering systems. Children's soccer teams use apps to manage schedules and messages. But in Congress, interactions with the public have improved only incrementally. Most businesses today hire programmers, designers, and data specialists, either directly in-house or through contractors. We need to hire more in Congress, and we need to recognize the higher pay required for these in-demand skills. This is especially true for Congress's work, since Congress's work product is digital. It's information, laws that greatly impact the world and people's lives. Congress is decentralized, which helps for generating innovation. Each office should be encouraged to innovate to improve their operations, and the centralized offices like the CAO should help facilitate and scale any innovation. One downside of the decentralized structure is silos. There should be more collaboration across the legislative branch. Just as the AOC oversees all the physical infrastructure of Congress, some or one group should have authority over all the digital infrastructure in Congress, something that's currently lacking. One possibility is the Congressional Data Task Force, which formerly was called the Bulk Data Task Force, a recommendation from the Modernization Committee to change their name, which is great. I have worked closely with them over the years, and they've been very successful at getting different silos to work together on foundational issues of improving Congress's digital infrastructure. I recommend that they be given more direct authority to lead Congress in these areas. My other suggestion is the newly created House Digital Service, which Chairman Kilmer mentioned in his opening remarks. It should have a broad mandate to allow it to expand as it matures, eventually working on transformative projects that transcend the legislative branch, not just in the CAO. Hackathons could also help with collaboration. The hackathons we have hosted have been more ideathons with non-technical staff, but institutional offices could host more traditional hackathons with coders from across the ledge branch. We should also better coordinate with the Senate. There's significant duplication of efforts between the two chambers on things that would not threaten the independence of each chamber. For example, legislative drafting systems could be better aligned or combined. We should continue to open congressional data. I commend the Library of Congress for just this week announcing public access to the congress.gov API, which should happen later this year. More congressional sites like clerk.house.gov should follow suit. We should do an assessment of mission-critical systems that have been developed in committee and leadership offices and ensure that they can be supported in the event of a change of vendor or leadership of the office. I believe that that should include our DomeWatch app and DEMCOM intranet, as well as other systems I'm aware of, like the GOP Cloakroom site and the Rules Committee and NDAA amendment systems. All custom systems that are made for the House, like those systems, should be open source by default. This would help other state and international legislatures reuse our work and collaborate on shared challenges. And it would also ensure that we're not locked into a single vendor, saving long-term costs. The House cloud approval should be revamped. It's too slow and inflexible, in my opinion. For example, my co-witness today built an app specializing in managing the congressional tour process, but the approval process took too many months and was opaque. We should welcome innovators like her. We should also create a new process to accept unsolicited technology proposals. I often get meeting requests from companies that believe their technology is a good fit for Congress, but they don't know how or who to present it to. Finally, my final recommendation is we should modernize constituent communications. This is more of a big idea, which I was asked to come up with. Think of big ideas. So currently, the public can only send an email to their member of Congress, which usually results in a generic response. This hasn't changed in my nearly 20 years here in Congress. Most people would prefer to have their message posted publicly, like on social media or an online petition. We should build an open platform for constructive discussion of bills before Congress. Users could post public opinions of bills before Congress. Advocacy groups could post en masse. There could be upvoting and downvoting functions. There would have to be content moderation, like with any open online platform, but the goal would be respectful civic dialogue. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thanks, Mr. Dwyer. Our next witness is Reynold Schweickert. Mr. Schweickert is a senior advisor at Lincoln Network. Previously, he served as a senior technology advisor at the General Services Administration. He's also served as the Director of Technology Policy for the Committee on House Administration, a strategic advisor on technology and cybersecurity for the House's Chief Administrative Officer, and as the Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Government Printing Office. Mr. Schweickert, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Hopefully I'm smart enough to use the technology. Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, and members of the committee, I'm pleased to appear today to testify about ways to improve the digital capacity of the House of Representatives. We'll be speaking to structural issues that raise the cost of implementing digital initiatives to serve members, staff, civil society groups, and last but certainly not least, your constituents. Let me give the committee a kudos for another successful recommendation with the fully funding of the Modernization Fund by the appropriators earlier this week. In over 20 years supporting the House and the legislative branch, I've collaborated with stakeholders across the House of Representatives and the legislative branch built working relationships with executive branch agencies, members of civil society, academics, and businesses to increase the transparency, effectiveness, and resilience of the House. Three key areas to consider are: one, how should technology be governed and funded in the House and across the legislative branch? There's not a single overwhelming problem, but rather a series of smaller and medium-sized issues which cumulatively increase costs and impede the pace of technological change. A critical step would be creating a method for house-wide prioritization of projects to avoid the added costs and delays of technologists juggling as many as 10 different projects at the same time. Other improvements would include clearly chartering the House's technology organizations, consolidating control over infrastructure, and allowing for innovative acquisition strategies to improve the onboarding of new technologies. Secondly, what technology products or improved processes should be mandated to improve the digital experience of all stakeholders? Rethinking and automating time-consuming and expensive manual processes can improve transparency while freeing up funding to continue modernization. Regarding the creation of committee hearing documents, I estimate that $4 million could be freed up by the automation of automatically creating hearing documents. Further, I recommend extending the clerk's legislative information management system, or LIMS, to include internal committee legislative workflows to standardize processes, improve resilience, and reduce the number of so-called cuff apps supporting committee processes. Third, how should the tensions between creativity and stability be managed? The use of open source software can be a proxy for this discussion. Where and when, how should it be used? There's also a tension between standardization and diversity of tools. When should workflows be part of centralized products such as LIMS, and when is having a variety of choices important? The House has used open source software for many years. In my written testimony, I discussed the different aspects of open source utilization and how to structure its use for the full range of House tools. There is an understandably high standard for the reliability and resilience of the legislative process. The use of open source should be incorporated into that development process and using the recommended acquisition flexibilities for core House tools. On the other hand, consider the oversight process in a typical committee where each side and individual members seek a competitive advantage for their views, or Steve Dwyer's intranet to support Democratic members. A robust strategy to encourage innovation and competing tools allows members to pick the best tools for their individual needs. Both ethics concerns and regulations regarding the use of the members' representational allowance, or MRA, can limit the use of open source software. For example, members using the MRA to create open source software can't supplement other members' MRAs by releasing it for general use. This is a problem which could be addressed. In summary, these are complex issues with many nuances and interdependencies. I'm happy to respond to your questions or participate in further discussions as needed. I look forward to working with this committee to continue progress on these important issues. Thank you, Chair Kilmer. I yield back.
Mr. Schweickert. And last but not least, we are joined virtually by Melissa Dargan. Ms. Dargan is the co-founder of AppMy LLC, a company that builds digital platforms for government, such as tourtracker.com. She previously served as a staffer for Congressman Ed Royce on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She also helped launch the Congressional App Challenge, the nationwide initiative that works with members of Congress to develop district-specific challenges for students who are interested in technology. Ms. Dargan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, and members of the Select Committee. I'm honored today to testify. Customer-focused, innovative technologies have advanced, yet many everyday congressional constituent services are managed manually. Member offices can benefit from facilitating a more transparent and welcoming tech startup ecosystem on Capitol Hill for new tech products. Like many in this room, I came to Washington, D.C. over a decade ago to make a difference. Prior to launching Tour Tracker, the tour management platform that has helped book over 124,000 tours and that is used by nearly 100 member offices to digitally organize constituent tour requests, I started my career as a staffer on Capitol Hill. First, working for Representative Ed Royce's DC personal office, and then the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Next, I co-launched the Congressional App Challenge, a district-wide competition for middle school and high school students that encourages them to learn to code and inspires them to pursue careers in computer science. Based on my experience as a former staffer and now tech entrepreneur, I am uniquely positioned to identify the challenges and opportunities of growth related to tech innovation in Congress. When I first started on Capitol Hill as a staff assistant, I remember processing many constituent services manually. From constituent tour requests to flown flag purchases, these important responsibilities were tracked using printouts, binders, Excel spreadsheets. It was fragmented and inefficient. At the time, there were no digital alternatives that the House offices were approved to use. So while these tasks seemed easy, they were tedious, repetitive, and time-consuming. Fast forward to nearly a decade later, despite the advancements made in commercial technology, most House offices were still processing administrative work such as tours and flags manually, pretty much the same way I was doing it years prior. So seeing this market opportunity, I set out to create a product that I wish existed during my time, a platform that would simplify and digitize the congressional tour process. Planning DC tours is a great constituent service that allows you as members to connect directly with the people you serve when they fly into our nation's capital. By developing a tech solution, my goal was to allow staffers to improve the quality of constituent engagement while minimizing administrative tasks, which took an average of about 12 to 20 hours a week. Thus, staffers would then be freed up to do what they came to Washington, D.C. to do, affect change. Working on a new startup company already faces hurdles. The added House complexities, such as the lack of new vendor support and lack of information on navigating how to even sell to a congressional office, made establishing a needed tech product very difficult, even for someone like me who understands how Congress operates. The closed nature of the House creates restrictive barriers that ultimately decrease competition and prevent new technologies from ever succeeding. I respect and understand that the House has high standards for new tech approval. Protecting security and personal identifiable information are critical to ensure the integrity of the institution. That said, upholding these priorities and creating a welcoming environment for new tech products can be done simultaneously. Through my experience, some opportunities for change the Select Committee can investigate include, in the category of transparency, for instance, to eliminate information asymmetry, there should be a clearly defined process, including feedback and tracking, along with outline requirements that provide a roadmap for new tech submissions while maintaining security protocols and structures. Then in the category of support, to reduce any confusion, the House should designate a point of contact for these new tech submissions so that submitting entities know where they are in the process. Lastly, in the category of streamlining, to maximize efficiency, the House may want to consider working with the Senate to align their approval standards and processes for new vendors, and especially ones that are already approved in either chamber. Thank you for all the work the Select Committee has done to bring innovation to the halls of Congress. It is my hope that these suggestions pave the way for more efficient, creative, and innovative solutions that make a difference ultimately to improve a member office operations and constituent services. I look forward to answering your questions and to continuing the discussion with the Select Committee. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Dargan, and I now recognize myself and Vice Chair Timmons to begin a period of extended questioning of the witnesses. Any member who wishes to speak should just signal their request to either myself or to Vice Chair Timmons. Let me kick things off. I have one kind of broad question that at least two of you spoke to, and then I have one super specific question just because it's something that bugs me. On the broad question, both Mr. Dwyer and Ms. Dargan mentioned some of the challenges onboarding new technology and working with outside vendors. I'm just hoping you can give us some council as to, so is there a difference in how the House and the Senate approach this, and how does the executive branch approach this? Any lessons we can learn in terms of potential reforms we might propose that would make this process easier in the House?
And start on that, and Melissa, if you might want to jump in as well. I'd say the way the House and the Senate deal with outside technology vendors is very different. I'd say the House is actually significantly more open. So my personal opinion is that the House should take steps to be further open, but compared to the Senate, we're actually in pretty good shape. They, for example, have been very hesitant towards cloud technologies, which the House was hesitant for a while, but lately has been more embracing. And thank goodness we did before COVID, because we've been using cloud technologies a whole lot. But the executive branch, it's mostly the FedRAMP program, which we rely upon. When Zoom, for example, they had to go through and have a FedRAMP version, which is approved by the executive branch. And that makes it easy for us in the House to say, okay, well, we can approve that as well pretty quickly. But there's still, as Melissa was talking to, many challenges in the House trying to adopt new technologies. And my overall top recommendation is that we shouldn't treat all, they call it cloud services, the same, because they're just very different. Some are, like Melissa's, very specifically made for Congress. And so I think those should be given extra attention because they're built for us. And then some are just, generally use applications from companies that don't really know or care much about Congress. And so those should maybe, especially when they don't have much PII, personally identifying information, perhaps they don't need to have as much scrutiny. But those are my thoughts. I'm not sure if Melissa has additional thoughts.
And yes, thanks for addressing the question. I do echo what Steve had mentioned initially. I will say, in terms of the difference between the House and the Senate, openness was one that I had noticed with the House in even entertaining initially cloud services. What I will say is some of the similarities with processes where it first goes to security assessment and then approval and authorization by the committee is similar in both chambers. The difference I had experienced was in time of the approval process. So what was interesting was, while the Senate was less open initially to cloud services, they only took 2.5 months, about 7 weeks, to approve Tour Tracker, where in the House, it took about 34 weeks, 8 months. And that's just something I wanted to be able to call out, because in a time frame like that, with a small company like mine, it could be very difficult for a company who is trying to get set up if they have to wait 8 months before even being able to have the allowance of operation. The other thing I wanted to note in terms of what the executive branch does. So some of the agencies, they also have programs that support small businesses. They have an office like within the SBA where small businesses, women-owned businesses, underrepresented businesses can have a support to help them through the process to understand how to get through and get approved. And in the executive branch, they also have, I believe it's sam.gov, where there's a list of requested contracts that they're hoping to get built or get done that these businesses now can refer to and submit proposals for. So that may be something to consider on the House side if there are open recs of items that offices are hoping to be built or need help to be built, that companies can submit proposals for in order to then be reviewed. And that's just something I wanted to make sure I focused on, where on the executive side, they do provide support. There's a whole website for small businesses to on-ramp and onboard, and that may be something where small businesses and startups can be put together where they have support from Congress.
I think that's really helpful, something we should take a closer look at. The other, if my colleagues will indulge me asking the specific question that bugs me. One of the challenges we have in this place is we're sort of 435 independent contractors, each with our own operations, each using often different technologies, although there's some similarities. Where this is particularly problematic is where we have failings identifying common themes across the offices. So just as an example, during COVID, we were getting a lot of calls about postal disruption. And when I was on the floor, I would talk to my colleagues and say, man, we're really, phone's ringing off the hook about postal disruptions. And they would say, oh yeah, our office too, right? And right now, we may have our caseworkers work that issue, but there's no way to feed it into any sort of institutional learning. Same thing around challenges with the VA. Or right now, I think all of our offices are getting overrun with a combination of visas and passports. And, to me, there would be value in exploring some way to use probably, almost assuredly, anonymized data that comes from our constituent management systems to spot and address trends in the casework so the institution can solve some of these problems that usually rest at the agencies. So I wanted to just take your temperature on that. Good idea, bad idea, something our committee should recommend? Go ahead.
Absolutely. I've given a little bit of thought to that issue. The data is held the different CMS vendors. And I think that a process where that data is extracted and anonymized into a larger pool that could be subject to analysis for looking at trends, both for constituent service and themes for oversight, would be very valuable to the institution.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I think it's something that I know a lot of the companies that run the constituent database as well, and I think it's something they probably would be excited about. I think offices could maybe opt in. It wouldn't have to be mandatory, and certainly anonymize the data. But I think it would. I think we neglect all the information that we get from our constituents. If you take it as a whole, we get millions of emails every week from people all across the country, and many thousands of casework problems with the federal government. And of course, we individually deal with them, but I think there should be some more collective action. I think it's a great idea.
Vice Chair Timmons.
Mr. Dwyer, what is your new fancy app that you're working on? What's your new piece of technology that you're working on?
Our newest one is, we haven't sent the press release on it yet, but Dome Directory 2.0 is live as of a few weeks ago.
What's the difference?
We added a number of new features. A number of them were requested by Mr. Hoyer himself, but he also hears from other members on the floor a lot about it. We added, you used to only be able to look at the whole Dem caucus or Republican caucus. Now you can look by committee. You can also look by major caucus, which I think is somewhat unique to the app. A lot of people don't have good data on, which are the major caucuses and the different roles and leadership roles. We added a search box right at the top because you used to only be able to quiz yourself, but now you can just go find a particular member. Mr. Hoyer wanted that because he often just wants to pull up a person. We added 3 or 4 different bios for every member, and the issue I'm most excited about is we added defining votes from this Congress. So we picked 4 or 5 of the most consequential votes of this Congress, and we listed for every member.
Who owns Dome Directory and Dome Watch? Hoyer's leadership?
Yeah, the Office of the Majority Leader.
Okay. And he will give it to whomever, if he ever does leave Congress?
I assume that's the case, yes.
Okay. That's very interesting.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I interrupt real quick? Mr. Schweickert, you said something that if you use your MRA to develop an app, you can't share it. So how do you guys get around that?
Leadership.
They're not using MRA, they're using leadership funds.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
So the 59th recommendation we made last Congress was to create a common committee calendar portal to help with scheduling and reduce conflicts. I think this is something that could make a big impact on this institution, and we're having a tough time getting traction. I know that it's being worked on, but do y'all have any thoughts on what we can do to maybe move a little quicker?
One of the challenges with technology and committees is there's not a clear belly button to push. It's bifurcated between the clerk and the CAO and the committees themselves. So I think one of the recommendations is to clearly focus who is responsible for legislative product, so there's an accountable owner. I think the other challenge that I alluded to is there's no gatekeeper for scheduling projects. So in the CAO, teams may be working on 5 to 10 projects. So they tell you they're working on your project, and they are, but they're sort of shuffling things back and forth versus a program management kind of functionality that says, what are the 3 things we want to accomplish in the next couple of months? Let's knock them out, and then let's figure out what the next set of important things
Well,
are.
the additional resources we got in the modernization account, could we use those to speed it along?
Absolutely.
Mr. Dwyer, what do you think?
I think the building foundation has been laid. 7 or 8 years ago now, there was the creation of something called docs.house.gov, which is not widely used by the public, but it's used internally a lot. I know Reynold worked on that. I know the Bulk Data Task Force worked on that a lot. For the first time that ever, all committees are required to post all hearings in one place, and that's where they post it. They're also required to post all testimony and documents related to every hearing.
Is that done in House rules?
I believe that's in-house rules is what required that in the creation of it. And that's another example where the House is ahead of the Senate. I hear that their committee schedules is not all in one place, and their videos for all the committees are not in one place. So I commend the House for that. So I think that's the foundation. But I think amplifying that, making a more consumer-friendly version of that, so you can at least see all the conflicts. I mean, that's sort of the first step, and I think that could be a project for the modernization fund.
Ms. Dargan, what are your thoughts?
Yes.
Oh, I was asking about
Oh,
trying to deconflict the committee calendar. We made a recommendation to do a common committee calendar, and we're still working on it. So do you have any thoughts on what could move it along?
I think both of the panelists who have addressed that question have covered it in terms of how to get that. And just having worked on the Foreign Affairs Committee prior, I will say that that will be a very helpful tool moving forward. So whatever the Modernization Committee can do to push that, whether it's recommendations or freeing up, certain funds to be able to create something like that, would be very helpful.
Okay. One quick last question. This could save millions of trees in this institution. I rarely use the materials that are printed out. I mean, every time I go to financial services, there's a stack that thick. And
Some of us still use paper.
well, we could make it optional. We could make it optional. But I mean, how challenging would it be to go paperless as the default? And if somebody wanted paper, they could get it.
Completely agree. We have certainly reduced the amount of paper quite a bit. I'm sure there's a lot more to be done. Now, my expert here worked for a long time at the GPO, who probably has more thoughts on these.
I think that, for example, the recommendation about automating the production of a committee hearing document from docs.house.gov, so extending that, allows for the creation of an electronic document. I think that in a lot of the costs that are incurred are in the creation of that first copy, and then the printing becomes pretty incremental. And as members have become more digitally savvy, I think it's a much more practical alternative with exceptions. It's interesting you mentioned the pager in some random desk drawer. That was a huge controversy at the time when we tried to replace it, because there was an equity issue that members needed to have exactly the same notice of a floor vote. And if it was coming through email or some other mechanism, somebody might be 3 minutes delayed. It was like a horrible thing. And as people became more accustomed to how the digital world worked, that issue went away, and the pager's rightfully in the back of the desk drawer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Go back.
it's clear there's a bias against change in this institution. Mr. Dwyer, I'll start with you. In your estimation, where is the ideas bottleneck? Is it house admin? Is it the leadership offices? Is it the various agencies? But like, what's the crux of this? Who needs to champion at least employing technological improvements?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of ideas out there. I think we need to do a better job of sort of collecting them. I think the Modernization Committee deserves a lot of credit for collecting all these ideas. But I think there needs to be more of a permanent institutional way to collect these ideas and to properly evaluate them and elevate and prioritize them. I think we just need to create the processes to collect those. I think, again, the Modernization Committee shows that, once you create that process, you get a whole lot of very good ideas. I think at every level, member office, committee level, leadership, institutional offices, I think there's a lot of good ideas. I would say that on the institutional offices, I think there's a lot of ideas, but they often are afraid to share them. They're just more risk adverse. So I think if we could somehow give them a little more authority to sort of improve things rather than, I think often they feel that their job is just to keep the status quo flowing.
But who's the we? Is it the Speaker of the House? Is it majority leaders, minority leaders? Is it the chair of House admin? Who needs to kind of inspire it other than the ModCom?
I think in technology, unfortunately, there isn't much of a lead. I mean, I think House Administration provides leadership, as does individual leadership offices. But I think a lot of it goes to the different institutional offices for a lot of the technologies here on the Hill, and they're just very sort of disjointed, where you got the CAO, you got the clerk, you got the library. And I think we really need more authority across all of them. In my prepared testimony, I recommend the Bulk Data Task Force, which is now the Congressional Data Task Force, which I think is, if they had more authority, they could sort of do more good things. But I do think it's a lack of leadership is correct.
If I could just ask one more of you too. I loved your recommendation about an open public discussion forum for bills. Take us through just quickly, if you would, how that would work, from conceptualization to actually implementation based on the status quo. How could we approach that?
Sure, thank you. It's just that, right now, as was largely the case when I started in Congress nearly 20 years ago, if you want to weigh in on legislation before Congress, you just have to send your member an email, and then you might get a response, often weeks later, and it's usually kind of canned, and so that's sort of a frustrating process often, not always, but often. And the idea is just that nowadays, when people take time to write an opinion on something, they usually want it posted publicly. I mean, that's just what they expect in the age of social media. And so I think because we haven't created a system like this, so the system I envision is just an open platform of all bills, try to structure the conversation, try to keep it focused on legislation and policy. There would, of course, like any open online system, there'd need to be content moderation, which is difficult. But I still think, you could have simple functions like upvoting and downvoting. It wouldn't have to always be messages. It could just be support or not support different bills and stuff. And I just think it would be a large project, but I think it could be very constructive in the long run.
Could it be attached to congress.gov or something like that?
That's what I imagine, yes. Okay. It certainly would use the database from congress.gov for all the current bills to try to structure the conversation.
All right, I yield back. Thanks for your, oh yeah, please, Mr. Schweickert.
In terms of what's limiting progress, I think that I would, with the many silos comes turf, and there's a tendency to negotiate around those sort of perceived immovable objects. When docs.house.gov was mandated in House rules, one of my jobs at House Administration was to manage the implementation and the creation of it. And there was a committee that didn't think that they would be subject to those rules, not to get into oversight versus appropriations differences. And with the support of the Speaker's office and negotiation to understand the business process and appropriations, managed to create an all-encompassing solution. And so I think that I would point to the silos and someone or some organization that could be House administration, could be the leadership, to really arbitrate those differences and say, we understand that's in your turf or in your charter, but we're going to look at this from an institution-wide perspective and make a better solution.
I appreciate it. Thank you both.
Mr. Davis. Sorry, did you have a question? No. Okay.
You know, Ed,
We call Ed
seniority on this, even this select committee matters. And
Perlmutter is the ideas bottleneck, actually.
it clearly is. It's I call it Broncos fan inertia. Quit triggering me, Ed. Quit triggering me. Hey, look, I want to thank Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chair Timmons for recognizing me before Mr. Perlmutter today. Reynold, I don't want to ruin your reputation by saying this, but you've been a longtime friend of mine, and I have just appreciated the work that you've done to make this institution as technologically limited advanced as we are today. I mean, that's like moving a Herculean effort forward, trying to get an institution to change, and you've been part of that process to make that happen. And it's great to see you back here in the House office buildings again, and I certainly hope you don't go away. He's the guy, if you want to know any institutional technology issues, he's the one to turn to. And then also, and this is where my questions are, Reynold, is you mentioned the newly launched House Digital Service, and you mentioned you recommended its expansion, right? I wasn't here earlier. Have you already gone over that process at all? Okay. You also highlight the House's institutional issue of not having a central body to prioritize those technology products. That was something Mr. Dwyer just mentioned. I actually happen to think House administration should be the clearinghouse for solving those problems. And I was reminiscing with former Chairman Harper just about an hour and a half ago about how it was awesome to make sure we dealt with furniture issues, transparency issues when it came to spending. And now House administration is dealing with HR 1. We're dealing with more legislative issues. It's become more of a legislatively or leadership appointed authorizing committee. And that to me is a big change. And frankly, I think it puts what this ModCom committee is trying to accomplish by making the House as an institution move forward. I think it puts that in a back burner. And that has to change, in my opinion. Do you see that, Reynold? And do you have any recommendations for what we should do going into the future on House administration?
So certainly as a longtime House Administration Committee staffer, I have to support the role of House Administration in these processes. If you look to the Canadian Parliament, they have a long-serving Chief Technology Officer. I think he's getting ready to retire. And so there was continuity in a technology strategy and a technology roadmap. And so my testimony, I talk about the difference between sort of stability and innovation and how to manage that tension. And I think that there is a role to sort of herd the cats in terms of keeping the innovation from disrupting the institution. We need more innovation, by the way. That's not a, keep the door shut. But, how to manage that in an effective way. I think some of the listening sessions that have taken place to understand what are the needs of the different job roles, what is a legislative counsel versus a staff assistant versus a scheduler, what are their challenges in supporting the member and the institution are important.
Your time on House administration mirrored my time as a staffer too for Congressman Shimkus. And I can tell you today, the access to training, the access to products, the access to technology is much, much more ubiquitous than it was when I started in the 90s and worked throughout the early 2000s. But we've got a problem and an issue that this committee I know has debated and House administration has not debated enough. What is your suggestion on how do we find that balance between the House and the CAO trying to develop technology when there might be that technology that we could get off the shelf and maybe work it into our security apparatus. What is that fine line?
So I think that, so there's two kinds of technology, right? There's everyone in the world needs Zoom, and the House needs to use Zoom as well. So what are those non-proprietary technologies or non-legislative specific? And then there's the what do we need to have developed, like Melissa's application that no one else in the world needs to use. I think one of the missing pieces is how to leverage the energy and the enthusiasm of the civic tech community. There's a lot of people who want to support the legislative process, that want to strengthen the first branch of government, and some of the ethics concerns, some of the acquisition concerns, prevent that from happening. If you look at the executive branch with challenge.gov, they have different statutory authority to use contests and challenges. You know, build me a better airplane and I'll give the one who builds the best airplane the contract and the money. It speaks to some of these issues that were discussed earlier in terms of having a defined process that's open and transparent in terms of how we do that. So I think going back to acquisition and competition. I mean, one of the problems I think, my opinion today with challenges is if you have a contest and we'll give you $1 for the winner, you get into, ethics concerns and so on. The Library of Congress has authority to provide funding, which they've used to work on congress.gov. But the House seems to lack that same authority to say, I'll give you $5,000 for the world's best, constituent communication widget. And Steve, I think, may have some thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say it's a good point, sir, that you made on like whether to build or buy. And I think you certainly want to buy if you can, if there's there's no reason to build something that already exists. But I think we are somewhat unique now. We're not entirely unique. There's a bunch of other state legislatures that do a lot of the same things we do, and international. The Tour Tracker app's a good example. Another good example is, the Senate recently developed in-house a really nice, clean new app for, it's called Quill. It's for managing letters and signatures. And that saved, our office, that saved us so much time this appropriation season compared to previous seasons. Great efficiency gain.
Did you say the Senate developed something before the House?
Yeah, and it's very rare that a tool is being, a bicameral tool, it's now in use in both chambers and the same one.
Great.
So it's a great example of, nobody else really has the same letter signature problem that we do with 535 signatures that we always have to, jumble on different letters. So.
Well, I appreciate your testimony, both of you. Thank you, Chair Kilmer, and I would seriously like to sit down. This is a very leadership-driven operation here. And I was very supportive of the legislative branch modernization fund, but I have some big concerns with how that money is being utilized right now, with an overwhelming amount going to the Appropriates Committee and to the CAO. And I would love to sit down with you and your boss to talk about some of these concerns if that would work out too.
Of course.
Thank you. Thanks. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver.
This whole issue of technology is one that I appreciate the committee leadership bringing to us. I want technology to be my servant, but there seems to be an effort afoot to make it our God, and not at this committee hearing, but I have a 6-year-old grandson who's constantly trying to teach me, how to use this phone that I had no business getting, because all the stuff on here I don't know about, but my 6-year-old knows everything. So I have some apprehensions about this going all the way in as it relates to technology. However, every office probably has a contract with a technology person, somebody that IT comes in and the computers go down, the printers go down, and I'm just, and we probably pay, maybe as much as, we all probably have contracts, probably 20 to 50 may be the range, maybe even more than that. And so if we're spending that kind of money and technology is in some ways becoming, ahead of us, changes every night. And I get mad at this phone because it says essentially, stupid, I told you I'm not going to function unless you update me. And, but do you think, at least those of you who've been around here, believe that maybe each office needs to have not just a contract, but somebody in there, just like a LA or a regular member of our staff at all times, who not only could, help with problems in the office, but also next step technologies. I mean, we here in Congress, we're in a situation where we have to catch up. This is not like making a decision about, just another move. We're talking about catching up. So, what if we had the dollars in our MRA, do you think that it would be a good idea for members of Congress to have a technology person in-house?
I certainly think so, sir. I think that's a great idea. I think that's happening more and more. I think there's just so much more that they need to do, even versus 5-10 years ago when I was in a congressional office. A lot of that is in digital communications. Every office needs to, not just take a bunch of pictures and post them on Twitter and Facebook, but they have to do more technical Facebook Lives. They got to take their boss live, and there's a lot of technical tasks that didn't exist many years ago. And so I think we've been recommending within the Democratic caucus, the use of the title digital, so digital aide or digital manager, and those people should be technical people, so not just communications specialists online, but also are competent with many different technical tasks. I think data is also critical for every office. Every office, when they communicate with their constituents, they're using complicated databases and targeting and such. And those are technical tasks that require, and I think having someone in-house is good because they can sort of do all sorts of these different tasks for you, including more basic IT support as well. And so I think that's absolutely needed, that we can't just think of traditional congressional staff of political science and history majors, but also more technical staff I think are helpful all around.
And if I could add, sir, I agree with Steve's comments. The complementary aspect of that is to continue to standardize the core IT, so the person you're paying for isn't figuring out how to make the computer get updated, but rather that's something that the CAO should manage, so that the space where you have a technical advisor, digital advisor, is, as Steve said, on communications, and I think on analytics, increasingly, what did the executive branch or the industry or the trade association, they provide you a set of information to support their positions. There's many resources, but I think someone in the office who is in support of your positions to do data analytics and say, this is true, this isn't, you ought to ask them this question because, would be very helpful.
Start in.
I will add to that for individual offices, and this was touched upon earlier, silos, right? So if each individual office has their own staffers and they come up with innovative solutions that other offices could benefit from, this is where it's going to be important to also have something that's a way in which these digital individuals can all communicate, because I know from personal experience, one issue that an office can experience, other offices have experienced in the past as well. And if everybody's coming up with their own way in which to tackle it, starting from scratch, it can be inefficient and ineffective. And I would say if the office decides to have an individual digital person, the house should find a way to be able to bridge these silos, so that one issue that gets resolved in one office, there can be an easy way to implement that in others. And whether that's an open forum, whether that's a way that they can all communicate, I think there should be a way to bring these silos together as well on a holistic level, because that will help close some of these gaps.
Thank you.
Mr. Perlmutter.
So that sort of leads into the question that I was going to have, starting with you, Ms. Dargan. Just listening to this is sort of an age-old problem of centralized versus decentralized. And, you know, you call us silos, but we're offices. We're individual offices, and we kind of do things on our own, but we need to have better networking and conversation. And it could be about technology. It certainly could be, you know, we did a big veterans pinning thing for, you know, Vietnam vets. And we started it and nobody really knew about it, but then the word spread. I mean, there are good things that any offices could use. So we have to have a better networking process, I think. But my question is a broader one, which is sort of a procurement acquisition kind of issue. When you're a small business and you want to, you know, introduce your product to my office or to the Congress as a whole, to the CAO, what is the process? I don't even know. I mean, I'm going to show my ignorance right here.
Well, thank you for posing the question. In the House side, the way that a startup would pitch even a product would be the member office would have to support and turn in a document into the CAO asking for that startup and that product to be reviewed. This was something when I initially first started in actually getting approval, didn't even realize myself, because there was no information publicly known of how I could even get approved or that I needed approval in the beginning. And so a member office would have to support a startup or a vendor and submit documentation to the CAO. The CAO security team will then review the product to ensure that security assessment and risk assessment is done appropriately and that the technology is safe and secure for member offices to use. Once that is approved in the CAO side, it gets sent to CHA, where then CHA then does the final authorization. And if the product or company gets authorized at the end, then it can be approved on an approval list where member offices can now use this technology. So there are multiple steps, and it all starts with a member office needing to submit a company to be reviewed initially. There is no open proposal where I could submit something myself and say, hey, I know that this is a problem. I've spoken to other offices. Can I submit Tour Tracker, for instance, to be reviewed by the CAO directly? I would have to first get a member office to support me and then have them submit that documentation and information in order for me to be reviewed or even looked at.
So you can't go straight to the CAO?
Currently, I was unable to, and I don't believe there was a process to do that, because I was told I needed a member office to support and turn in the documentation to even get me through the door.
Is that the same for the Senate?
In the Senate, it was a Senate office had to also champion a vendor. And for them, though, their process is Senate office sends a risk assessment to be reviewed by the Senate Sergeant of Arms. Then the Senate Sergeant of Arms reviews the risk assessment, provides their assessment to the Rules Committee. And then the Senate office also has to write a letter to the Rules Committee asking to use official funds, assuming that the risk assessment was approved and passed. So it is very similar in that it has to go through first a risk assessment on both chambers, and then it also has to go through approval by a committee. On the House side, it's CHA, and on the Senate side, it's Rules.
Thank you.
Just want to mention that
Thank you.
if we had a common committee calendar, then the chairman would still be here and he wouldn't have to be out. I will,
Just saying.
Mr. Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about tech talent. I know that Congress is not exactly a hotbed of tech talent right now. For all of you, do you see a way that we can become a little bit more of an attractive institution for that kind of talent? I know it's going to be hard to compete economically with compensation, but how might we reposition ourselves and actually make it cool to serve the country with tech skills in Congress? Mr. Schweickert?
Yes, sir. I think that I had an opportunity to speak with a group of the Tech Congress fellows, and they're very impressive. They're very accomplished, and so I think from a rotational method, that there are people who are concerned about democracy and this institution who will step away from higher salaries and contribute. What's lacking is building kind of that core capability, and people like Steve are kind of unique of having led technology strategy for Mr. Hoyer for 20 years. I would just say I think that money is certainly part of it, but it's also the ability to get something done. These are motivated people. You hired, if you had a Formula One driver fellow and you give her a golf cart, she's not going to go as fast and far as she does around the track. She's probably not going to stay very long because it's not very satisfying to be here. So I think that whole ecosystem are, am I using modern tools? Are there modern methods? Is there the political will or the process to be effective and make change? All contribute to making the place, I think, more attractive.
Culture. Mr. Dwyer?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I think we could look to the executive branch for some inspiration. I think this is something that President Obama worked on and something that President Trump continued through their initiatives like the U.S. Digital Service and 18F at GSA. They created different flexible employment models like they did. I think they started with like 6-month and 12-month tour of duty. Say you're a Silicon Valley engineer, but you're a little tired with your job, but you want to help your country, you want to serve your country.
Like a sabbatical.
Yeah, sabbatical sort of thing. And I think they realized that those were often pretty short because a lot of these, even the smaller projects, you really got to dive into for perhaps longer than a year. So I think they've expanded to 2- and 4-year tours of duty. But they also found that a lot of those people end up staying. A lot of those people really do love more of a mission-focused work and get excited by the work. And so after their tour of duty ends, they actually are able to work inside the agency. So I think that's a good model that we should look to
I appreciate that.
in the legislative branch.
Ms. Dargan?
I would echo that. Like the Innovation Fellows were part of the executive branch's initiative where it was a short stint at first. And then what you could do is either elongate, but it gave these individuals who possibly had an interest in civic public service a taste of what it's like. And what's great is they have the tech background. Getting them in for maybe a 6-month, a year, 2-year stint gives them the ability to at least give back. And in a number of cases, I know a number of Innovation Fellows, they ended up staying in government and transition away from the private sector because they felt that this was a fulfilling mission. They were put on projects that had end dates and deliverables and actual results. So to them, it was also fulfilling because they delivered something that was used by the government at the end. So I would say, if you think about it a little bit, it's like the Teach for America model, right? Mm-hmm. But it's, hey, come take that sabbatical, work in Congress for a year or two, It gives them the ability to get a little bit of a flavor of what it's like to work in public service, especially if they were curious, but it wouldn't be necessarily such a huge shift in change if they wanted to go back. The other part of it, I would say, is recruiting. Because when I went to business school, I remember a number of these programs and organizations would come to our recruiting events. If something like this were to be, launched within Congress, it would be important to get the word out and be able to recruit these individuals who you would want to target to come over, whether that's the companies and going to them and pitching this kind of idea, or going off to like engineering programs in the various schools to let them know about this opportunity. The biggest thing in the pipeline as well is making sure you get the word out and recruiting the right people.
Great
Could I
recommendations.
add just
Yeah,
one
please.
thought, sir. So today, the General Services Administration is recruiting a chief technology officer for a limited term appointment, exactly in this model. Dave Shive, the CIO, is engaged in extensive social media outreach. I think they have a session next week where they're going to have an open meeting for anyone who's considering applying for the position. So sort of following up on Melissa's comments, they're very intentionally building an entire advertising and recruitment campaign to bring in a world-class technologist for GSA.
Outstanding. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the use of open source. Can you speak a bit about the benefits of requiring new technology created for the House to be open source? Have you seen any examples of government or congressional tools being built using open source? And I guess I also want to get a sense of, are there ethics concerns under current ethics rules when it comes to individuals within the House using open source code and problem posting forums like GitHub?
Yeah, if I could start, in my written testimony, I talked about a couple different use cases here, and I talk about the Congressional Art Competition, where there's not a lot of concern about the makers of Tempura ink or something, using the art competition as a leverage point into Congress. When we set up the Congressional App Challenge, when I was at House Administration, the Ethics Committee was at that time, the staff of the Ethics Committee was very concerned about sort of undue influence of big tech and how to limit that impact. They provided some verbal guidance about the use of open source, but never, to my knowledge, issued anything in writing to sort of lay out that process. And so, the House has been a longtime user of sort of generic open source technology, bringing, incorporating those functions. I think that an acquisition, one of the reasons I suggest an acquisition authority is you can explicitly have a sort of market-based competition that recruits open source developers. I think the point that would be very useful, if we could get to it, is how to have an ongoing kind of co-development collaboration with civic technologists. Maybe through the the House Bulk Data Task Force. It's still sort of burned into my brain, the old name, but some mechanism that arbitrates or sets up a framework. Arbitrate's not the right word. Sets up a framework for that kind of participation.
Is there something that impedes that right now?
I think it's inertia, and I think there's ethics concerns about that. One of those concerns is about the tasking of outside entities. So it's like, Steve, this product you wrote, this dome product is really great, but we need these 27 enhancements to it, and he does it for free, and the institution uses it for free. Is that an appropriate scenario? So a lot of these things are fact-based, the fact pattern, but there are those fact patterns that would raise issues, I think.
Go ahead, Mr. Dwyer.
I think it's a good question. I think the House uses lots of open source software. I mean, a good example is most House websites that are run by the CAO are done in a system called Drupal, which is a very worldwide popular open source website software for managing websites and creating websites. And the way it works, being open source software, is that all that code is available free on the internet, and it creates a very healthy feedback loop where lots of people are making fixes to the code and lots of people are suggesting fixes to the code and bugs with the code and reporting bugs. And so it's just a large online community that sort of works on a group project, which is just a system of code that makes good websites. I think the ethics committee concerns, in my opinion, are a little overblown. I've seen an ethics paper on this from probably 4 or 5 years ago. I don't think that they're actively working on it. I could be wrong. I don't know. But I think that there was some concern that through that open feedback loop where people do just ask for things like, hey, it would be great if your feature that you made had these features, and they often do it. But they do that not just for Congress. They do that for anyone. If they just think it's a good idea, they do it. So I think ethics was worried that this could be some loophole for big tech to come in and see the needs for us and give us a large gift by making a bunch of software. But I don't think that that's much of a risk. I think the traditional use of open source is just a collaborative something, and I don't think that violates the spirit of the gift rule, which is what ethics is concerned with.
Ms. Dargan, do you want to take a swing at that pitch? Or?
I believe my fellow panelists have covered most of it, and I agree in terms of what they say with the ethics concerns. I also think with open source, prior when I was on the Hill, there was this notion that it would, affect like risk assessment or what that would mean. But what I will say is when you've looked at open source examples, the building of extra features, if there was a concern of any risk, this is where in the House side, the CAO would come up and have the ability to review any additional pieces that were built off to ensure that it's safe for any member office to use. And that would just be a process that would also be needed to put in, to be established.
Let me hit one final topic on my end. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any additional questions. Mr. Schweickert, you actually spoke to the issue around sort of the siloing of technology development across the Congress. There's different support offices involved like CAO and AOC and the Office of the Clerk. So how do we encourage more collaboration in technology development, and how do we encourage the CBO and the GAO and the GPO technology development teams to collaborate as well?
So I think that, my recommendation has been to look at the scope and chartering of those existing technology organizations. I mean, to be clear, they collaborate today. It just has friction as part of that process, so they're a little less productive. It's one of the death of 1,000 cuts. The House is unique, as far as I know, in national parliaments in having multiple institutional IT organizations in a single chamber. Some organizations, like the UK Parliament, in fact, has a single CIO for both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but that's probably a bridge too far for us. So I think that looking at consolidating that institutional IT into a single organization would have the most impact, but is the most difficult. If that's not possible, consolidating into the clerk's IT organization for legislative functions. So, House Office of Leg Counsel, has some IT functions. They're relatively small, both for the efficiency of putting them together, but also from a charter point of view. Clerk owns all legislative IT regardless of where it is, so you know who is responsible for it.
I think it's a good question. I think it is a problem that there isn't authority over all these different, because these different silos do very large things. I mean, you got the CAO manages all the communications with the public and all the websites of members of Congress. The clerk handles all the voting and the internal operations of the floor and the websites related to that. The library and GPO handle more of like the historical records, and nobody's really in charge of how they all interact. So I want to go back to the Congressional Data Task Force. It's one of the few areas where I have seen them interact very well, and that's now 10 years now they've been working together. But I do think, like the UK model, of having a single person that had authority over them, or as I suggested in my remarks, maybe the task force has authority over all of them to sort of embolden them to make some more large changes and deal with the silo problem.
We one of the things we did at House Administration, working with the Appropriations Committee, was try to create a single a process for the cybersecurity initiatives of the different IT organizations, and to create a common assessment so that the appropriators could look on an apples-to-apples basis on the level of IT risk in the different organizations across the ledge branch, which really most of those organizations, except for the AOC, are part of the legislative workflow. They're part of that supply chain to get a bill to the president's desk. That was a very intensive effort. So I think that solving that on the broader aspects of those different IT organizations is worthwhile. But it's one of those things where incremental progress is probably more achievable than a grand solution.
Can I just add back to the task force model? It was unique that the House rules, when they created it, said that they must meet regularly, and they must, at least once a year, I believe, meet with the public to discuss their progress. And so I think just having some structure, force the silos to meet with each other regularly, just make rules about that, and to meet with the public, the users of this information, at the end of the day. I think
is that the place to do it? Is the task force the place to do it, rather than having a position, right, like CIO with dotted line relationships to all the technologists in these various agencies?
I think either is possible, but I think the authority kind of doesn't exist right now, but should be created in either a person or a group like the task force.
I would agree with that.
Ms. Dargan's nodding her head. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add. Okay. Any other questions from my colleague? Go ahead, Mr. Cleaver.
Yeah, maybe a question. What if you guys would take a guess? What would be an entry-level salary for a technologist? If in considering you guys are probably familiar with how the pay is over here, but just a guess.
Yeah, I would say I have some experience in this in the House Democratic Caucus, pushing digital specialists, for example, who aren't necessarily coders or designers or engineers, which is more technical and of higher level degrees that are more in demand. But I think because it's a new position in a lot of offices, it often is pretty junior, but I still think it's a great start. And so I think most of the staffers with digital in their title are being hired above a normal staff assistant type position, but not much above. But I think if they're able to prove their worth, I think they often have their salaries rise pretty quickly within offices that I've seen.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just realized we have 4 members of this committee on financial services, including Mr. Timmons. And we have Jay Powell today, so that's why I think a couple of members are going.
Well, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're both here. So with that, I'd like to thank our witnesses in particular for being here and for their testimony today, and thank our committee members for their participation, even with financial services conflicts. As always, I want to thank our staff for putting together a terrific hearing. I think the insights we got here definitely sort of cohere to some specific recommendations that our committee can make. So thank you for that. And to our stenographer, thanks for, I'm sorry we talk so fast. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.